Welcome to this channel. Before you watch this video, it's a good idea to press the subscribe, like, and share buttons with your friends so that this channel continues to grow. Thank you. I moved to a small town on the edge of West California in late September, right when the summer heat was finally starting to back off. The town is called Darrow. You probably never heard of it. Most people who live in California have not heard of it either, and that should have been my first warning sign. I found it through a rental listing online. Cheap, quiet, close to the coast. I was going through a rough year, and I just needed somewhere to disappear for a while. The drive-in was long. I took the highway for about 2 hours, and then turned off onto a road that did not seem to exist on my phone map. The GPS kept trying to reroute me back to the main highway, but I'd written down the directions from the landlord on a piece of paper, so I just followed those. The road was paved, but barely. Dry grass on both sides, tall and pale yellow, the kind that looks like it could burn if you looked at it the wrong way. The house was fine, a little old, single story, with a front porch that faced west. The landlord, a man named Gerald, met me outside. He was maybe 60, thin, with the kind of tan you only get from spending your whole life outdoors. He shook my hand, gave me the keys, and then said something that I did not think much about at the time. He said, "Make sure you are inside before the light goes flat." I asked him what he meant. He just nodded toward the western sky and said, "You will know what I mean when you see it." I figured it was just an old man way of saying get home before dark. I smiled and said sure. He got in his truck and drove off, and I stood there watching the dust settle behind him. And I noticed that the road he drove down curved around a hill and then just kind of disappeared. There were no other houses visible anywhere. No neighbors. Just the grass and the sky and this house. The first week was peaceful. I worked from home, took walks in the morning, made simple food, slept well. I started to feel like myself again. The sunsets out there were genuinely beautiful. The sky would go from blue to orange to this deep, bruised purple in maybe 20 minutes. And I would sit on the porch and just watch it. That color felt sacred almost, like something you were not supposed to see but were getting away with. It was on the 8th night that I first noticed it. I was sitting on the porch later than usual. The sun was almost gone. And then, for just a few minutes, the light did something I had never seen before. It did not get darker the way it normally does. Instead, it went completely flat, like someone had taken all the depth out of the world. The shadows disappeared. Everything, the grass, the porch railing, my own hands, looked like it had been printed on paper. Two-dimensional, dull. The color drained out of everything at once, and the air went completely still. It lasted maybe 3 minutes. Then the regular dark came, and everything felt normal again. I sat there for a long time after that, trying to explain it to myself. Atmospheric thing, I thought, and some trick of the dust in the air or the angle of the sun at this latitude. I went inside, and I did not think about it again until the next evening when it happened again, at almost the exact same time. And I was watching more carefully this time. During those flat minutes, something moved in the grass. I want to be careful about how I describe what I saw, because I do not want to make it sound more dramatic than it was. It was not a monster. It was not something running at me. It was just a shape, a low, slow shape moving through the tall grass about 40 feet from the porch, parallel to the house, going from left to right. It moved the way a large dog moves when it is walking with its head down, except that the grass around it did not move the way it should have. The blades parted in front of it and closed behind it, but there was no rustling, no sound at all. The whole world was still silent during those flat minutes, and this thing moved through it like it belonged to that silence. Then the regular dark came, and I heard the normal sounds of the night again. The crickets, a distant car somewhere far off on the highway, the wind picking back up. And whatever I had seen was gone. I stayed on the porch for a long time with my legs feeling a little weak, telling myself it was a coyote or a deer. I had seen deer in this kind of grass before. They move quietly. That was all it was. I called Gerald the next morning. He answered after a long pause, like he had been waiting for me to call, but hoping I would not. I told him what I saw. I described the flat light first. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How long have you been sitting out there in the evenings?" I told him almost every night since I arrived. Another pause. Then he said, "I would not do that anymore if I were you. Sit inside after 5. Keep the porch light off." I asked him why. He said, "The light out there does something funny near the coast hills this time of year. Animals get disoriented. You do not want to attract anything while they are like that." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. I almost believed it. But I noticed he did not ask me to describe what I saw moving in the grass. He did not ask if it was big or small, fast or slow. He just told me to go inside, like he already knew what it looked like. I stopped sitting on the porch after 5. I kept the front curtains closed in the evenings. Life went back to normal for about 4 days. And then, on a Wednesday night, I woke up at around 2 in the morning for no reason. No sound, no dream I could remember. I just opened my eyes, and I was completely awake. The kind of awake where your body already knows something before your brain catches up. I lay still and stared at the ceiling and listened. The house was quiet. The night outside was quiet. Then I realized what was wrong. The crickets had stopped. I grew up in a place where crickets were just part of the night, constant and invisible, like white noise you stop hearing after a while. But when they stop, you feel it immediately. The silence they leave behind is a different kind of silence. It has weight to it. I lay in my bed and felt that weight pressing down on the whole house, and I did not move for a long time. After maybe 10 minutes, the crickets started again, all at once, like a switch had been flipped. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. But before I closed my eyes, I looked at the window across the room, the one that faced west toward the grass, and I saw that the curtain was not fully closed. There was a gap of maybe 4 inches along the bottom edge. And in that gap, there was a color that should not have been there at 2 in the morning. A pale, flat, colorless light. Like the flat light from the evenings, but in the middle of the night, just sitting there in that 4-inch gap, completely still. I did not get up to close the curtain. I just pulled the blanket up and looked at the ceiling until morning came. When morning came, I did the thing that made the most sense to me at the time. I made coffee, and I walked outside and I looked at the grass. Normal daylight, normal sounds. A few birds moving around in the dry brush at the far edge of the field. Everything looked fine. The grass was undisturbed as far as I could tell, tall and pale and leaning slightly in the morning breeze. I stood on the porch with my mug, and I felt a little embarrassed about how scared I had been the night before. Daylight has a way of doing that to you. But then I looked down at the porch boards in front of the door, and I saw the dirt. There was a thin layer of pale dust on the porch, the kind that builds up slowly in dry places. And in that dust, there were marks. not footprints exactly. More like long, shallow grooves, evenly spaced, about the width of my hand apart. Starting at the edge of the porch steps and stopping right in front of the door. Whatever had made them had walked up to my front door and just stood there. The grooves at the stopping point were a little deeper, like something had shifted its weight forward. I crouched down and looked at them for a long time. I took a photo on my phone. Then I went back inside and locked the door and sat at my kitchen table and thought very seriously about leaving. I had a lease. I had already paid 2 months up front. I had nowhere else to go that felt affordable. I told myself the marks could have been made by anything. By a large bird, by the wind pushing something across the porch, by my own feet in a pattern I had not noticed. I was good at talking myself out of fear back then. I had years of practice. I called my friend Dana, who is a very logical and calm person, and I described everything without trying to make it sound scary. The flat light, the shape in the grass, the light at the window, the marks on the porch. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she said, "Have you slept okay lately?" I said mostly yes. She said, "Have you been drinking more than usual?" I said no more than normal. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "I think you should look up the history of the area. Old farming towns out there sometimes have water contamination issues. Certain chemicals can cause visual disturbances if you are drinking the well water." It was a good and practical suggestion. I appreciated it. I bought bottled water that same afternoon. It did not help. The flat light came again that evening, right on schedule, and this time I watched it from behind the living room window with the lights off inside so I could see out clearly. The world went paper thin and colorless the way it had before. And this time, there were 2 shapes in the grass, both low and slow, moving in the same direction as the first one had, parallel to the house. And again, no sound from them, no rustling. But this time, one of them stopped. The other kept moving and disappeared into the deeper grass near the tree line, but one of them stopped directly across from the window I was standing at. It was maybe 30 feet away. It was hard to judge size because the flat light made everything look like it was at the same distance, like depth had been removed from the world. But it was big. Bigger than a coyote. Bigger than a deer, I think, though I am still not completely sure. It stayed still for the entire remainder of the flat light, just pointing itself at my window. I stood completely still too, not even sure it could see me in the dark interior of the house, hoping that the glass and the darkness behind me were enough. Then the regular dusk came back, the purple and blue of normal evening, and the shape was gone. Not gone like it walked away. Gone like the return of normal light simply did not include it. That night I pushed my dresser against the bedroom door. I know how that sounds. I know it would not stop anything that could move through flat light like it was a natural habitat. But it made me feel like I had done something. And sometimes that is all you have. The next morning I drove into the nearest town, which was a 20-minute drive, and I went into the only diner I could find, and I sat down, and I asked the woman behind the counter if she knew anything about Darrow. She set down the coffee pot very slowly. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "You staying out there?" I said yes. She said, "Alone?" I said yes. She looked at the window for a second, just briefly, and then she looked back at me and said, "How long?" Not how long are you planning to stay? How long have you already been there? I told her 11 days. She nodded slowly, like she was doing a calculation in her head. Then she refilled my coffee, even though it was still mostly full, which I think was just something to do with her hands, while she decided how much to tell me. She sat down across from me, which I did not expect. The diner was empty, except for an old man at the far end reading a newspaper, and he did not look up. Her name was Patrice. She had lived in that area her whole life. She told me that the land around Darrow had been farmland going back about 100 years, and that the families who originally worked it had a very specific rule that everyone knew and nobody ever wrote down. You did not build a permanent home on the western edge of the valley. You could farm it. You could pass through it. But you did not sleep there, not regularly, not for more than a few nights in a row. She said the old-timers called the boundary the fold, though she did not know exactly where that word came from or what it was supposed to mean. She said it like it was just a word that had always existed in the mouths of people from that place. I asked her what happened if someone did sleep there regularly. She looked at me with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite fear, but somewhere between the two. She said, "The ones that stayed too long started seeing the flat light." I felt the hair on my arm stand up. I had not used those words with her. I had not described it to her at all yet. She just said it. Flat light. Like it was a known thing with a known name. I asked her what the flat light was. She said she did not know exactly, only that it was some kind of a boundary condition, a moment when whatever lived on the other side of the fold could cross over into this side without fully arriving. She said they were not dangerous during the flat light as far as anyone knew. They were just... She paused and looked for the word, oriented, getting their bearings, learning the layout of things. She said the problem started after they had been watching long enough to feel comfortable. After they had counted the windows and the doors and understood the shape of the place and the patterns of the person inside it. I asked her how long that took. She said it was different for everyone they had heard about. Depended on how much you moved around inside, how predictable your schedule was, how many evenings you gave them to watch you. I thought about my routine. Coffee at 7, work at the kitchen table until noon, lunch, afternoon walk, back by 4, dinner, porch until dark. 11 days of exactly that. I had handed them a complete map of myself without knowing it. I asked her what Gerald knew about all this. A long pause. She looked down at the table. She said Gerald had been renting that house out for about 6 years. She said the turnover was high. Most people left on their own within the first 2 weeks, spooked by the light and the shapes and the sounds, or the absence of sounds. She said Gerald always told new tenants to be inside by 5 and never explained why. She said she thought he told himself he was giving people a fair chance to leave before anything got serious, and that this was how he squared it with himself. I asked her what serious meant. What happened to the people who stayed past the point where the things outside had finished watching and started doing something else? She was quiet for a long time. The old man at the end of the counter turned a page of his newspaper. Outside, a truck went by on the road, throwing up a small cloud of pale dust. Patrice put both hands flat on the table, and she said, "3 people that I know of personally did not leave in time. One of them was found in the grass about a quarter mile from the house. The other 2 were not found at all. That was over about 30 years, and Gerald has owned the property for 6 of those years, so I am not saying he knows all of that. But he knows some of it. I left $40 on the table, and I drove back to Darrow, and I packed everything I owned into my car in about 25 minutes. I did not clean the house. I did not leave a note. I drove out on that barely paved road with the pale yellow grass on both sides, and I did not look in the rearview mirror once until I hit the main highway. When I finally did look, there was nothing behind me but empty road and a flat, colorless sky along the western horizon. even though it was only 11 in the morning and the sun was nowhere near setting. I have thought about that sky every single day since. What it meant that the light was already flat at that hour. Whether 11 days had been enough time. Whether finishing is something that can follow you when you leave. Or whether it only works on a place it has already learned. I still do not have a good answer to that. But I sleep with the curtains fully closed now. Every window, every night. And I never sit outside in the evening anymore, no matter how nice it looks. Some things do not need to finish watching before they start. Okay, next news stories. The trail ends at the same place every time. I want to start by saying I am an experienced hiker. I have done solo trips in the Cascades, in the Rockies, in the backcountry of Montana. I know how to read a trail, how to use a compass, how to stay calm when something goes wrong. I am telling you this because what happened to me in the Oliver Ridge Wilderness area last October is the kind of story that sounds like a beginner making bad decisions. And I need you to understand that it was not that. I did everything right. The forest just did not care. Oliver Ridge is a wilderness preserve about 4 hours north of where I live. It is not a popular hiking destination. The trails are maintained but barely, and the permit system discourages casual visitors because the area is large enough that a search and rescue operation would be genuinely difficult if something went wrong. I had done a 2-night trip there 2 years before without any problems. Beautiful old growth forest, a few good creek crossings, and a ridgeline view that is honestly one of the best I have ever seen. I wanted to go back and do the longer loop, 5 nights, about 42 miles total. I planned it for 3 months. I drove up on a Thursday and started the trail at first light on Friday. The weather was cold but clear. The forecast was good for the whole week. I felt sharp and ready and genuinely happy in the way that only happens when you are finally outside after too long sitting at a desk. The first day was perfect. Good mileage, a campsite by a creek, a fire, early sleep. Nothing to report. The second day was also fine until about 3 in the afternoon, when I realized I'd been walking for about 2 hours and had not reached the fork that my map said should be there. The trail had been straightforward, no branching, no ambiguity. I should have hit the fork at roughly the 11-mile mark of the day. My GPS said I was at 12.5 miles. I stopped and looked at the map for a long time and then kept walking, figuring I had misread the scale. Another 40 minutes. Nothing. Just trail going straight into deeper and older trees. The kind where the canopy is high enough that the light on the ground goes gray, and even by midday. I stopped and took a careful GPS reading and compared it to the map. According to the coordinates, I was standing about 100 yards past where the fork should have been. I walked back 100 yards and stood in the middle of the trail and looked in both directions. Unbroken trail, no fork, no side path. Not even an old, overgrown one. I checked the map 3 more times. The fork was supposed to be right there. I was standing exactly where it should have been, and there was nothing. I have had map discrepancies before. Trails get rerouted, old paths close, GPS has its limits under heavy canopy. I marked the spot, adjusted my plan to stay on the main trail and look for the next landmark, and kept moving. Reasonable, calm. That is what you do. I made camp that night at a flat spot near a cluster of big firs. Ate, checked my gear, went to sleep. At some point in the night, I woke up. I do not know what time. And I lay in my sleeping bag and listened. The forest was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a normal night outside, where you still hear small things moving and wind in the branches and the occasional bird. This was a complete and total quiet. The same kind of quiet I imagine you would hear if you could somehow turn off the world. I lay there and listened to it for what felt like a long time. and I thought, this is very strange. And then I went back to sleep because I did not know what else to do with that feeling. In the morning, I packed up and started walking. And after about 20 minutes, I came to the fork that should have been there the day before. Same fork, same marker post, exactly as described in my trail notes. It was just there now, in a completely different location than where I had been standing the previous afternoon. I stopped and stared at it for a long time. Then I took a photo of my GPS coordinates next to the fork marker. I still have that photo. The numbers do not match the map, not even close. I took the left branch of the fork, which was the route I had planned. The trail climbed for about an hour and then leveled out along a ridge. Good views, cold wind, everything normal. And then I saw the campsite. A flat spot near a cluster of big firs with the ash ring of an old fire. I stopped walking. I recognized it. The shape of the clearing, the way 3 of the firs leaned slightly together at the top. The small boulder on the north side that I had used as a windbreak the night before. It was the same campsite. I had walked for almost 2 hours uphill along a different trail branch and arrived at the exact place I had slept the night before. I sat down on the boulder and spent about 30 minutes doing nothing but thinking. I am the kind of person who trusts data over feelings, so I went through every logical explanation I could come up with. Trail loops I had misread on the map. A second campsite that just happened to look identical to the first. Some kind of GPS error that had been compounding over 2 days. I wrote all of these down in my trail journal because writing things down helps me think. When I read them back, they all sounded possible, but none of them felt true. The boulder had a specific crack running diagonally across its face that I'd noticed the night before, and traced with my finger while I was eating dinner. I looked at that crack now, and it was the same crack. Not similar. The same. I made a decision. I was going to walk back down the trail the way I had come, back to the fork, and take the right branch instead. If the forest wanted to keep showing me the same campsite, I was going to take every available option in the opposite direction. I marked the site on my GPS, took photos of everything, and walked back down to the fork. It took about an hour. The fork was still there, same marker post, and I took the right branch this time and walked hard for the rest of the afternoon, covering ground faster than I normally would, focused entirely on putting distance between myself and that clearing. The right branch was narrower and less used. Branches closer to the trail, more roots underfoot. The kind of path that requires you to pay attention to where your feet are going. I was glad for that. It kept my mind occupied. I counted my steps for a while. I identified tree species out loud to myself. I did the things you do when you want your brain to stay in the practical world and not drift toward the thing that is trying to scare you. At around 5 in the afternoon, with maybe an hour of good light left, the trail opened up into a flat clearing. Big firs in a cluster on the north side. A boulder with a diagonal crack across its face. An ash ring from an old fire in the center of the clearing, right where I had built mine the night before. I stood at the edge of that clearing for a long time without walking into it. The light in the trees was going gray, and even the way it does in old growth in the late afternoon. No wind, no bird sounds. I was aware of my own breathing in a way that you usually are not. I looked at the boulder, and I looked at the ash ring, and I looked at the 3 firs leaning together at the top, and I thought, very clearly and without any panic, I am not going to be able to walk out of this forest the normal way. I set up my tent at the edge of the clearing, not inside it. I did not build a fire, and I ate a cold meal, and I sat outside my tent in the near dark, and I looked at the tree line, and I thought about what I knew. The forest was redirecting me. Both trail branches, taken in opposite directions from different starting points, had ended at this place. My GPS coordinates were not matching my map in any consistent way. The distances I was covering did not match the time I was spending. Something about the geometry of this area was not working the way geometry was supposed to work. And then I thought about something else. Both times I had arrived at this clearing, I had come from the south, down the ridge and into the flat. I had never tried walking directly north through the trees, off trail. I had a compass. The creek I had camped at on my first night ran roughly east to west, about 3 miles north of my current position, based on the original map. If I could hit that creek, I could follow it east toward the trailhead. Off trail through old growth, 3 miles. Hard but doable in a few hours of morning light. That was my plan. I wrote it in my journal, and I zipped myself into my tent, and I listened to the total silence of the forest, and I told myself that in the morning I would walk north, and this would be over. Sometime after midnight, I heard something outside the tent. Not an animal sound, not a branch falling or something moving through brush. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like something dragging itself across the ground with great patience and no hurry at all, circling the tent at a distance of maybe 15 or 20 feet, going around once and then stopping. I lay completely still with my hand on my knife, and I waited. Nothing else happened. In the morning, there were no marks on the ground that I could find. No broken branches, no sign of anything at all. Just the clearing and the trees and the ash ring and the silence, the same as it had been every time. I packed up before the light was fully good, and I pointed my compass north, and I walked into the trees. Walking off trail in old growth is slow and physical. There is no clear ground. Everything is root systems and fallen logs and soft, wet moss that hides the shape of the earth underneath. So every step requires a small decision. I kept my compass in my left hand and checked it every few minutes, and kept the needle steady on north. The trees were enormous up close, some of them 6 or 7 feet across at the base, the bark deeply furrowed and dark with moisture. I felt small in the way that old forests make you feel small, which is usually a feeling I like. That morning, it did not feel good. It felt like a reminder. For the first hour, everything was fine. I was making slow but real progress, ducking under branches, stepping over logs, keeping my footing on the uneven ground. I checked my GPS every 20 minutes, even though I had stopped trusting it fully. The coordinates were moving, which at least meant the unit was registering my movement. I marked a waypoint every half hour so I could see a trail of breadcrumbs on the screen showing where I had been. At the end of the second hour, I stopped to drink water and check my position. I looked at the waypoints on my GPS screen. They formed a straight line pointing almost perfectly north, which was reassuring. I was doing what I intended to do, and I looked up from the screen to get my bearings visually, and I noticed a tree about 30 feet ahead of me. A big fir with a pale scar about chest height on its south-facing side, like an old blaze mark, long healed over. I had not blazed it. I had not touched any trees. I noted it and kept walking. About 40 minutes later, I stopped again. There was a tree ahead of me with a pale healed scar at chest height on its south-facing side. I walked up to it and put my hand on it. The texture of the bark around the scar, the shape of it, slightly longer on the left side than the right, was identical to the one I had seen 40 minutes before. I looked at my GPS. My most recent waypoint was about 800 feet behind me, which meant I had been walking for 40 minutes and covering ground, and the waypoints were still in a straight line on the screen. But I was standing at the same tree. I sat down on a root and I took several slow breaths and I looked at the tree, and I thought about what this meant. The GPS said I was moving north in a straight line. My compass agreed. My legs and lungs agreed. I had been walking hard uphill for most of the last hour. But the forest was putting the same tree in front of me twice. Either the forest had two identical trees in two different locations, which was possible but felt wrong in my gut, or I was covering ground on the GPS without covering ground in the actual physical world. Like a treadmill. Like something was letting me walk without letting me arrive. I stood up and I did something that felt a little desperate, but was the only test I could think of. I took my knife and I made a small, fresh mark on the tree, a shallow horizontal cut about 6 inches long, low enough that I would have to crouch to see it. Then I walked north again, compass in hand, for exactly 30 minutes by my watch. Then I stopped and looked ahead of me. A big fir, pale-heeled scar on the south face. I walked up to it and crouched down. Fresh, horizontal cut, 6 inches long, still pale and clean at the edges. Not dry yet. I stood up and looked around me at the forest, and for the first time since this started, I felt something move through me that was not logical or manageable. Just pure and simple fear. The kind that lives in the body before the brain has time to weigh in. The trees stood around me in every direction, identical and enormous and completely indifferent. And the light between them was gray and flat and went on forever. And I understood in a very physical way that I had no idea how large the space I was trapped in actually was, or whether it had edges at all. I forced myself to think. Panic burns food and water and time and solves nothing. I had 4 days of food left, water I could find. My emergency beacon was in my pack, a two-way satellite communicator that did not need cell service. I had been saving it for a real emergency because using it would bring search and rescue out here. And I had always felt embarrassed by the idea of needing to be rescued. I sat there in front of that tree with the fresh cut on its bark, and I asked myself honestly whether this qualified. A forest that folds back on itself. Something that circled my tent in the dark. 3 days in, and no progress toward the edge. I took the beacon out of my pack and I held it in my hands for a long time. Then I heard something that made me go completely still. From somewhere off to my left, not close but not far, maybe 200 feet away in the trees, there was a sound. Not the dragging sound from the night before. This was quieter, slower. A very faint and rhythmic sound, low and steady, coming from something large that was standing still and breathing. I did not move. I barely breathed. The sound was steady and slow. The kind of breathing that belongs to something that is not alarmed, not rushing, not hunting. Just present. Just aware. I stood with the beacon in my right hand and my knife in my left, and I stared into the trees in the direction of the sound, and I could not see anything. The gray light between the trunks went back far enough that whatever was out there was invisible inside it. After a few minutes, the breathing stopped. Not gradually, not fading as something walked away. It just stopped, the way you turn off a faucet. One moment it was there, and the next the forest was completely silent again, and I was alone in that silence with the marked tree behind me and the compass in my pocket and 4 days of food in my pack and no idea which direction was out. I activated the beacon. I am not embarrassed about that anymore. I held down the button and watched the small screen confirm that a signal was being sent, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 2 days. Whatever happened next, someone outside the forest now knew my coordinates. Or at least the coordinates my GPS believed I was at, which I no longer fully trusted, but it was the only set of numbers I had. Then I did one more thing. I stopped trying to go north. I stopped trying to navigate entirely. I picked a direction at random by closing my eyes and turning slowly and stopping without thinking about it. And I opened my eyes, and I walked that way. No compass check, no GPS, no map. I just walked and looked at the ground in front of my feet and tried to empty my head of any intention about where I was going, because I had started to form a theory, shapeless and hard to put into words, that the forest was responding to intention somehow, that the loop only closed around directed movement, that wanting to arrive somewhere was the thing being used against me. I walked for about 40 minutes through the trees with no destination in my mind, and just the feeling of my feet on the ground and the cold air on my face. And then the ground sloped downward in a way it had not done since I left the trail, a real sustained descent. And I followed it down through thinner trees, and then younger trees, and then brush, and then I stepped out onto the bank of a creek, wide and clear and moving east over smooth stones. I stood on the bank and looked at it for a long time before I trusted it was real. I followed the creek east. It took about 2 hours. The trees thinned steadily, and the sky opened up above the water, and eventually the creek passed under a small wooden footbridge. And on the other side of that bridge was the main trail. The actual trailhead parking lot was another hour east from there. My car was where I had left it, dusty and cold, sitting alone in the gravel lot. I got in and I sat there for a while before I drove. Search and rescue called me while I was on the highway home. They had received my beacon signal and were preparing to send a team. I told them I had made it out on my own, and I was sorry for the trouble. The man on the phone asked me where exactly I had been when I activated it. I read him the GPS coordinates off my beacon log. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said those coordinates put me about 200 yards from the trailhead parking lot. According to the signal, I had been standing basically at the edge of the forest the entire time, never more than a short walk from my car. I did not know what to say to that, so I just thanked him and hung up. I have looked at those coordinates many times since then on satellite maps. 200 yards from the parking lot. Flat ground on sparse trees, clearly visible on the imagery. That is where the GPS says I spent 3 days walking in circles, cutting marks into trees, listening to something breathe in the dark. That is where the forest put me through, whatever it put me through. I haven't gone back to Oliver Ridge. I haven't done a solo trip anywhere since. When people ask me why I stopped hiking alone, I tell them I just got busy, that life got in the way. It is easier than the truth, which is this: I am not afraid of getting lost anymore. I know how to find my way out of a place that wants to keep me. What I cannot stop thinking about is the breathing. How calm it was. How patient. How it stopped the moment I stopped trying to leave, like whatever was out there had just been waiting to see what I would decide. Like my decision was the only thing it had ever been interested in. And I have never been able to work out, not once in all the time since, whether I made the right one.